Love or pain? The painful truth about how narcissists treat their partners. Why does a narcissist do such deeply hurtful things to the person they claim to love? At the core, the answer is less about cruelty in the traditional sense and more about a fragile psychological architecture that depends on external validation to stay intact. In clinical terms, traits associated with narcissistic personality disorder are built on an unstable sense of self-worth that must be constantly regulated from the outside. A partner in this dynamic becomes less of a separate human being and more of a psychological resource, a mirror meant to reflect admiration, importance, and control. This is why the narcissist appears to need their partner so intensely, yet treats them with such disregard. From their perspective, the relationship is not a mutual bond, but a system of emotional supply. For the victim, this creates a confusing paradox. You are simultaneously essential and disposable. Healing begins with understanding that this contradiction is structural, not personal. It is not about your inadequacy, but about their inability to sustain a stable internal identity. One of the most pervasive patterns in this dynamic is chronic lying. A narcissist does not lie merely to deceive in the conventional sense. They lie to regulate their self-image. Whether it's fabricating reasons for being unavailable or distorting financial truths, each lie serves to protect or inflate their ego. Psychologically, this is tied to a defense mechanism known as self-enhancement bias, where reality is reshaped to maintain superiority. For the victim, repeated exposure to these distortions erodes trust not only in the partner, but in one's own perception of reality. You begin to question what is real, what is exaggerated, and what is entirely fabricated. Over time, this creates cognitive fatigue and emotional disorientation. The most effective protective strategy here is documentation, mentally or physically tracking inconsistencies, and maintaining external anchors of truth such as trusted friends or objective records. Rebuilding your sense of reality is a critical step in recovery. Control and isolation form the next layer of this psychological web. A narcissist often seeks to limit their partner's connection to the outside world, not always overtly at first, but gradually and strategically. This behavior aligns with coercive control dynamics, where autonomy is systematically reduced to increase dependency. By encouraging or forcing a partner to withdraw from friends, family, or even financial independence, the narcissist ensures that they become the central and eventually the only source of validation and decision-making. For the narcissist, this creates a controlled environment where their authority is rarely challenged. For the victim, it leads to a shrinking world, where options feel limited and escape seems impossible. The psychological impact is profound. Learned helplessness, reduced self-efficacy, and a growing sense of entrapment. Recovery here requires deliberate reconnection, rebuilding social networks, regaining financial literacy or independence, and reestablishing personal agency step by step. Then comes gaslighting, one of the most insidious tools in the narcissist's arsenal. Gaslighting is not just lying. It is the systematic rewriting of another person's reality. A narcissist may deny events, invalidate emotions, or accuse their partner of being overly sensitive or irrational. Psychologically, this tactic exploits the human need for cognitive consistency. When your internal experience conflicts with the external narrative imposed by someone you trust, your mind attempts to resolve the tension, often by doubting itself. For the narcissist, this ensures dominance. If you cannot trust your own perceptions, you are far easier to control. For the victim, the consequences include anxiety, self-doubt, and even symptoms resembling trauma responses. The path to protection lies in reclaiming epistemic authority, trusting your own observations again. Journaling, therapy, and external validation from grounded individuals can help restore this lost confidence in your own mind. Infidelity in narcissistic relationships operates under a different psychological logic than in typical partnerships. It is not primarily driven by dissatisfaction with the partner, but by an insatiable need for validation and novelty. A narcissist seeks what psychologists sometimes refer to as narcissistic supply, attention, admiration, and emotional reactions from multiple sources. Affairs provide a fresh stream of this supply, temporarily boosting their fragile self-esteem. For the victim, the betrayal feels deeply personal, often leading to self-blame and a search for what they lacked. But this interpretation is misleading. The behavior reflects the narcissist's internal void, not the partner's shortcomings. Healing requires reframing the narrative. Their infidelity is a symptom of psychological dependency on external validation, not evidence of your inadequacy. Establishing firm boundaries, or, in many cases, exiting the relationship, is often necessary to break this cycle. Finally, perhaps the most dehumanizing aspect of this dynamic is objectification. To a narcissist, a partner can become a symbol of success, attractiveness, status, rather than a fully realized individual with independent needs and emotions. This aligns with what psychologists describe as object relations impairment, where others are not experienced as whole, separate beings, but as extensions of the self. This is why appearance, behavior, and even personal choices may be tightly controlled. They are seen as reflections of the narcissist's identity. For the victim, this erodes individuality and autonomy, replacing them with performance and compliance. You are valued not for who you are, but for how well you serve a role. The long-term psychological cost is a loss of self. Your preferences, identity, and sense of worth become blurred. Recovery involves a deliberate process of re-individuation, rediscovering your values, making independent choices, and learning to see yourself as a complete person again, separate from the role you were forced to play. When you step back and view these patterns together, a coherent picture emerges. The narcissist's behavior is not random. It is a system designed, often unconsciously, to stabilize a fragile inner world at the expense of another person. Understanding this does not excuse the harm, but it does provide clarity. And clarity is power, because once you see the pattern, you are no longer trapped inside it. You can begin piece by piece to step outside it and reclaim your life. And as this dynamic deepens, control begins to move into the most intimate and personal spaces. How she presents herself to the world, what she wears, how she styles her hair, the way she applies her makeup. These are no longer expressions of her identity, but extensions of his. Psychologically, this reflects a profound distortion in relational boundaries, often linked to what clinicians describe as impaired object constancy within narcissistic personality disorder. The narcissist does not experience his partner as a separate individual with her own agency, but as a symbolic representation of his worth. If she shines, he feels elevated. If she falters, he experiences it as a personal injury. For the victim, this creates an invisible prison where self-expression becomes dangerous, and authenticity is slowly replaced by performance. The path toward healing here is subtle but powerful. Reclaiming small acts of autonomy, choosing how you present yourself, making decisions without seeking approval. These become quiet revolutions that rebuild a fractured sense of self. When that illusion of control is threatened, when she makes a mistake, expresses independence, or simply fails to meet his internal script, the punishment often follows. This punishment may not always be physical. It can be social humiliation, silent withdrawal, or calculated abandonment. From a psychological perspective, this is a form of behavioral conditioning. The narcissist reinforces compliance by associating independence with pain and obedience with temporary peace. For him, it restores a sense of dominance and control. For her, it creates a trauma loop where fear and relief become intertwined, making it harder to break free. The nervous system begins to adapt to unpredictability, often resulting in hypervigilance and chronic anxiety. Recovery requires breaking that conditioning pattern, which often involves creating physical or emotional distance, and relearning that safety does not have to be earned through submission. Criticism then becomes a constant background noise, subtle at first, then relentless. Nothing is ever quite right. Not her appearance, not her intelligence, not her decisions. But this criticism is not about improvement. It is about hierarchy. Psychologically, this behavior is rooted in downward social comparison, a defense mechanism where the narcissist diminishes others to maintain a sense of superiority. Each insult temporarily soothes his internal insecurity, but for the victim, the cumulative effect is devastating. Over time, she begins to internalize these judgments, leading to self-doubt, indecision, and a diminished sense of competence. The most effective counter-strategy is cognitive separation, learning to recognize that these criticisms are projections, not truths. Therapy, self-affirmation practices, and reconnecting with people who reflect your real strengths can gradually dismantle the false narrative imposed on you. Anger, in this context, is not just an emotion. It is a tool. A narcissist's rage often appears disproportionate, unpredictable, and deeply unsettling. This is intentional from a psychological standpoint. Such anger functions as an intimidation strategy designed to destabilize the partner's sense of safety and predictability. When someone is constantly on edge, they are far less likely to challenge authority. For the narcissist, this ensures compliance. For the victim, it creates a state of emotional dysregulation, where fear overrides logic and self-protection. In more extreme cases, this can escalate into threats or physical harm, reinforcing the cycle of control. The critical step in protection is recognizing that this anger is strategic, not spontaneous. Establishing boundaries, seeking external support, and prioritizing personal safety are not acts of defiance. They are acts of survival. The expectations placed on the partner often become impossibly high, yet painfully one-sided. She is expected to be everything: caregiver, homemaker, emotional support system, while her own needs are dismissed or ignored. Psychologically, this reflects an exploitative relational style, where one person assumes entitlement to another's labor without reciprocity. The narcissist externalizes responsibility for his well-being, placing it entirely on his partner. For her, this creates chronic exhaustion and a persistent sense of failure because the standards are designed to be unattainable. This dynamic can lead to what psychologists call role engulfment, where a person's identity becomes consumed by fulfilling others' needs. Recovery begins with redefining worth, not based on productivity or compliance, but on inherent value. Learning to say no, setting limits, and rediscovering personal desires are essential steps in reclaiming balance. And then, at its most destructive, the relationship crosses into overt harm, emotional, verbal, and sometimes physical. A narcissist may lash out when their control is threatened, using cruelty as a means of reasserting dominance. What's critical to understand is that this behavior is not a loss of control. It is often a calculated attempt to regain it. Psychologically, this reflects a fragile ego structure that cannot tolerate perceived rejection or failure. But for the victim, the impact is profound: trauma, fear, and a deep erosion of self-worth. Over time, this can lead to complex emotional patterns, including trauma bonding, where moments of kindness are misinterpreted as evidence of change. Breaking free from this cycle requires both clarity and courage, recognizing the pattern, seeking professional support, and, when necessary, removing oneself from the environment entirely. When you step back and look at the full picture, the pattern becomes undeniable. This is not love in its true form. It is control disguised as connection, dependence masked as devotion. The narcissist may appear charming, even irresistible at first, but beneath that surface lies a system built on extraction, not reciprocity. And yet, Understanding this dynamic is not meant to leave you feeling powerless. It is meant to give you language, clarity, and ultimately choice. Because once you can name what is happening, you begin to loosen its grip. If this resonated with you, if it helped you see something you couldn't quite put into words before, take a moment to engage. Share your thoughts, your experiences, or even your questions in the comments. Your voice matters more than you've been led to believe. And if you want more content that breaks down these complex psychological patterns in a way that feels real and actionable, consider subscribing, liking, and sharing. Not just to support the channel, but to continue reclaiming your understanding, your clarity, and your sense of self.